great teacher is the passing of David Hartman, we have not lost and will not lose the wisdom of his teaching. That wisdom is preserved through his many books and articles, and in our digital world through videos of his lectures. It is preserved through his influence upon those who have studied at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, or in locally delivered programs across North America, which have been developed and distributed by the Institute. It is preserved through the high schools for boys and girls in Jerusalem, which were founded by and are operated by the Institute. It is preserved through programs in Jewish studies, formulated at the Institute and taught in secular high schools throughout Israel. It is preserved through the Institute's programs for senior officers of the Israel Defense Forces. My wife, Elaine, and I first became connected to the Shalom Hartman Institute and the work of David Hartman about 8 years ago. Rabbi Frydman-Kohl of this congregation and Rabbi John Moscowitz of Holy Blossom Temple joined in a concerted effort to interest their respective congregants in the annual week-long summer program for lay people offered by the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. I admit I was skeptical, but Elaine and I chose to attend. We've been back at that program before subsequent summers and will be there again this summer. The experience of those programs was exhilarating. Studying perhaps 6 hours each day intensively in a way we have not done since university. David Hartman and the superb faculty which he identified and inspired, in turn inspired us. They inspired us to understand our tradition, to explore our tradition, and most importantly, to question our tradition as conventionally understood. For David, learning was not the acceptance of the words of our teachers, but acceptance of the challenge posed by great teachers, acceptance of the obligation and burden to think for ourselves. As he put it in an interview in in December of 2011, Halakhah is in your gut, the moral guidance you feel from the inside. If you lose your autonomous moral feeling, you lose your divine image. But this comment was made in response to questions from religious pedants makes it vintage David Hartman. As Rabbi Rick Jacobs, president of the Union for Reform Judaism, said of David in his eulogy, his brand of Judaism was fearless, always evolving, brutally honest, defying all labels, and yet profoundly authentic. This evening to Mark Shloshim, the 30th day following Rabbi David Hartman's funeral, we are privileged to be able to hear from 8 rabbis who have been deeply influenced by him. I will ask each of them to come up in turn, introduce himself or herself, and then speak for 4 or 5 minutes. Good
evening, I'm Rabbi Elkin from First Rider Congregation. I had the privilege of studying with Rabbi David Hartman at his Machon in Jerusalem periodically over the last 23 years since my ordination as a rabbi. Having gone to rabbinical seminary in the first place because of my desire for intensive, high-level Jewish learning, I was so grateful that there was a place in the world where I could continue my own learning, even as I devoted my professional life in the pulpit to sharing what I had learned with others. And I was particularly grateful that at that place, there were teachers to inspire and challenge me, most notably David Hartman himself, but also the other top-notch scholars whom he attracted to his institute. David Hartman was a man who was always brimming over with ideas, big ideas, articulated with passion and without fear. In the brief few minutes that I had to address you this evening, I wanted to share with you one of those big ideas which I always found particularly compelling. It's It's an idea which has particular relevance for us as Pesach approaches, followed by the Omer period leading up to Shavuot. Hartman drew a distinction in his religious thought between two fundamental paradigms, one of which he called the Exodus paradigm and the other of which the Sinai paradigm. To give you an idea of what he meant by this distinction, I want to share with you one of his typically provocative statements, this one about the Passover Haggadah. In one of his lectures, he labeled the Haggadah a, quote, Naturi Carta document. Naturi Carta, for those of you who aren't familiar, are the ultra-Orthodox Jews who reject Zionism and the State of Israel. They're the ones you see demonstrating against the State of Israel during the annual UJA Walk with Israel, and some of them went to see Ahmadinejad a few years back. What could Hartman have meant by linking the Passover Haggadah, beloved by Jews across the world and across the generations and across the denominations, with one of the most extreme and fanatical and marginal of Jewish groups? David Hartman was a theologian, and as such, he was always interested in the relationship between humanity and God. It is with that issue in mind that he read the Haggadah. And when he did so, he found a God who intervenes in human affairs in order to redeem a people who are passively waiting for that divine redemption to come. All the miracles brought by God in order to bring about the Exodus, all the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, the water from the rock, etc. For David Hartman, they all reflected divine power and human passivity, indeed impotence. And that's the message promoted by the Carta. We'll have our Jewish state when God is good and ready. Meantime, it's our job simply to wait and pray. That link is what led David Hartman to call the Haggadah a Naturi Carta document. The model of divine power and human passivity is, of course, not the only Jewish paradigm for the relationship between God and humanity, and it is certainly not the paradigm that David Hartman felt was appropriate for our era in human history. After the Exodus, Bnei Yisrael traveled on to Mount Sinai and received the Torah and its commandments. For Hartman, being subject to commandments meant that Bnei Yisrael finally had responsibilities. We have responsibilities. There are things we have to do. There are demands on us. We can't be passive. We are part of a community, and that community is part of the world. And every day we have to reach as high as we possibly can to do right by others in our community and in the world, to be a mensch, despite all our weaknesses, both moral and physical. We're not meant to wait passively for God to take action. At Sinai, God told us that it's up to us to take action, however imperfect it may be. Clearly, Hartman favored the Sinai model, and it informed everything about the way he lived his life, of course, including his Zionism. His was not a radical utopian vision of Judaism that wouldn't bring any grand messianic redemption. At best, it would help make things just a bit better, thanks to our own actions. Hartman told us we pray to experience God's presence, not to receive God's help. God has given us the power and the freedom to help ourselves. We don't always use our freedom well, of course. Indeed, we regularly mess up. Hartman once said that the story of the covenant between God and the Jewish people is that God fell in love with Abraham and got stuck with his grandchildren. We fail and fail and fail, but we have to be patient. There are no shortcuts, no miracles in the Sinai paradigm, just a lot of hard work. David Hartman was a traditional Jew. I'm sure he read the traditional Haggadah as Pesach Seder, despite his rather negative analysis of its theology. He loved Judaism, he loved the Jewish people, amazingly, he loved rabbis. And he also fought with everyone and everything he loved, not allowing us to be lazy or sentimental, insisting that we ask the hard questions and say the things that we're afraid to say. As you prepare for Pesach over the next couple of weeks, think about the Exodus paradigm and the Sinai paradigm, and consider which characterizes the way you lived your life. At your Seder this year, honor the memory of Rabbi David Hartman by asking some of those hard questions.
Martin Berman, Rabbi at Shalom Synagogue. I have tremendous
Hartman was always a vital element of the program. Every session that David gave, no matter what the topic, was essentially a session of David Hartman. Each of us tonight is really just sharing one facet of the diamond that was him. And I can imagine what he would have said if he was told he had 5 minutes to talk.
4 to 5.
Imagine what he would have said if he was told he had 5 to 6 minutes to talk. Briefly, I want to touch upon the question that goes back to Greek philosophy at a certain level. Is what is morally good commanded by God because it's morally good, or is it morally good because it's commanded by God? In essence, we come to Halakhah. Is something right because Halakhah says it is? Is it moral because Halakhah says it is? Or must it be moral in order for it to be Halakhah? I don't know if I can answer the question. But in way of David Hartman, we begin with a quick read of the text found in the Gemara, the second Kiddushin, which I'm cutting most of it out because I don't have time. It's propounded, it says there in the Gemara, Rabbi Ula, how far does the honor of parents extend? He replied, go forth and see what a certain heathen, Dama, son of Latina by name, did in Ashkelon. We were told how he would not disturb his father if he was sleeping on a pillow. There was a key to a chest in which a jewel was kept. And that was the paradigm for Kibbud Aim. A very Jewish idea, and yet the rabbis chose a non-Jew as a templar of it. What did David have to say on this passage? Quoting from classes that I had with him, this is not from his books, but what I wrote down, as he would say, the story about the honor given by the Gentile Donovan and Tina is a concept grounded in existence. It is not a Jewish, I would add, not a Halakhah concept of universal. The law mitzvah, according to David Hartman, there's an outside command in response to the outside, the other, the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Revelation, according to David, confirms the ethical. It doesn't create the grounds for the ethical. The consciousness of good is either the existence of the good and the need to be thankful, or the demand of the ethical behavior, or in our case, both kavod and yirah. And here in this story of the Gentile showing kavod, we join the idea of the universal and the particular. Thus, for David, there is an external moral good. This is not an answer whether it is good because God wills it or God wills because it is good. But it does demand that Halakhah must answer to a yardstick that is external to the halachic text. He wrote in the discussion section of Maimonides' epistle on Morrison, quote, the halachas cannot simply apply the law in mechanical fashion, but must boldly accept responsibility for his creative role in making the decisions for a community that chooses to live by the Torah in an unredeemed world. Halachic problems demand that the halachas listen attentively to both the Halakhah and the Haggadah of this tradition in order to gain a sense of direction that reflects the spirit of Judaism. Although he listens attentively to every aspect of this tradition, his decision is not a mechanical application of rules, but rather a creative act that grows out of the interaction between the weight of the tradition complexity of the present. This, I believe, is a very telling comment by David. Discussing repeating responses to Maimonides to an unnamed rabbi at the issue at hand, it is clear that there is more to Halakhah than mechanics. It means that Halakhah must answer to the spirit of Judaism, the moral underpinnings of our tradition. I believe that means if you fail to do so, you can issue a decision that fails to live up to the moral demands of the good, thus immoral Halakhah. Another lecturer who said the system, talking about Halakhah, will respond to the questions that people have. The law will change when the secular community, referring to Israel, will make demands on the law. The right-wing religious world is reacting to their needs. They are answering their questions and issues. We need a community that brings new issues to Judaism that needs to be dealt with, and leaders who will respond to those issues. It isn't God's fault that people don't respond to new issues. We need leadership that hears the community for what its questions are. Halakhah is a rabbinic method to get you into religious consciousness. As a medium is powerful, struggling with the world and our tradition. This is what David believes is the moral course of Halakhah.
Good evening, I'm Rabbi Elyse Goldstein from City Shul, downtown Toronto's newest Reform congregation. The very fact that I can use the title Rabbi before my name, and the passion, respect, and warmth that David Hartman had for women who earned that title, is why I've decided to spend my short time speaking about how Rabbi David Hartman pushed the halakhic envelope for women, and how the full spiritual personhood of women was forefront in his teachings. Those of you who know me personally know that in my life, I've been very upfront, some would say aggressive, about the issue of religious equality for Jewish women. I will never forget studying this issue with Rabbi Hartman and sparring with him about it as well. Put simply, I cannot comprehend how in the 21st century, after the deconstruction of the separate but equal apologetic for blacks, for Asians, for disabled folks, for gays, for everyone but women, we as Jews can continue to accept that category for our religious life. How we can accept and even celebrate that the female corporate presidents from Monday to Friday sit upstairs behind a curtain uncounted with no access to the Torah scroll during Tefillah on Saturday. Most of all, I cannot philosophically fathom how some of us actually exalt this truth with beautiful sounding rationales of women's spiritual superiority. To be patronizingly reminded by so many Orthodox rabbis that, quote, men and women are different, and so they have different roles and different rules, and why are you so upset about it? Was, for me, taking a deep and profound question of the nature of gender, humanity, and the religious enterprise, and turning it into a one unhappy feminist scenario unbefitting to the seriousness of the theoretical challenge I was feeling, and still often feel. This theoretical challenge David Hartman took seriously, and never once descended into the "why are you so upset about this" kind of argument. I share this personal struggle with you because there have been in my life an equal number of deeply thoughtful Orthodox rabbis who understood the righteous indignation, got it in their kishkas, struggled with it themselves, and made it part and parcel of their inquiry into a modern and sustainable Judaism. Those rabbis came up not with apologetics, but with a blueprint for thinking about the halakhic and theological implications of gender politics in Judaism. Chief among them, ahead of his time, and public and vociferous in his discourse on women and Halakhah, was my teacher, Rabbi David Hartman. Studying with him and getting to know him shook my preconceived notions about the intractability of this issue. For he wrote and practiced an orthodoxy that was engaged and wrestled meaningfully with the traditional boundaries of women's participation, and more importantly, with a halakha that preaches the full human dignity of women, but doesn't always practice it. In pushing a halakhic envelope for women, he rested on an underlying principle which is stronger than any piecemeal solution, giving women access to this thing or that thing, or giving women permission or temporary permission to participate in this activity or that. In his book, A Heart of Many Rooms, he writes the following: "It is not only to legal norms that we owe our allegiance, but also to the values and the human character that these attempt to realize." He constantly taught that his halakhic innovations around women were exactly that, attempt to realize the values of human dignity that Judaism teaches. In his last book, The God Who Hates Lies, in a chapter called Feminism and Apologetics, Lying in the Presence of God, he attacks the condescending methodologies of discourse, which I also loathe, positing that they absolutely devalue the dignity of women. In speaking about the refusal of the Orthodox establishment in Israel to solve the problem of avnot, women whose husbands won't give them a Jewish divorce, creating a lifetime of anguish and isolation, he questions the Orthodox Halakhist who said, seemingly empathetic of the avnot, quote, "It's my personal akedah," as if not being ready or willing to halachically solve the problem of thousands of chained women was that rabbi's own personal test of faith. To this, Hartman boldly asked, "Your akedah? Is that supposed to bring comfort to the abandoned woman whose life is passing her by?" But perhaps he is best well known among those who struggle with Judaism's gender biases for his courageous and landmark decision to publicly support the establishment of Halakhah in Jerusalem, the first partnership minyan where separate seating Orthodox davening is the norm, along with women having aliyot and reading Torah and leading parts of the service from their side of the mechitza, which retracts, by the way, for the Torah reading and for the Devar Torah. Of this he wrote, and I quote, "I became unable to justify women's exclusion from a minyan. Why should they be denied the religious dignity that comes with full communal participation, treated in essence as if they were not there? I cannot be bound or insist that others be bound by a halakhic theology that privileges certain kinds of sperm, wombs, and genes, but stigmatizes others." He did not support Halakhah because it made women feel better. He supported Halakhah because he rejected the halakhic theology that privileges men, period. What's more, and would put him at odds with the Orthodox establishment, is that he rejected the notion that biology is spiritual destiny, that there is an essential, existential, quote, female nature of woman that is eternally and factually true. In The God Who Hates Lies, Rabbi Hartman rejects the gender-based teachings even of his own teacher, Rav Soloveitchik, who believed that the definition of women in the Talmud reflects not merely a sociological reality of its time, but rather an ontological reality about the nature of women. Hartman writes, quote, "According to Soloveitchik, if you think you are meeting a modern, independent, self-sufficient single woman, dignified about her capacity to cope with reality, you are mistaken. It is an illusion. You are not seeing the real woman, the desperately lonely and abject Talmudic woman that lies at the ontological heart of even the most seemingly capable or contented modern female. Is the woman we see walking the streets today the woman of the Talmud?" He asks. "No authority in the world," he says, "can convince me that she is. No past authority can make that a reality." So this creates his conflict. The God who loves permanence wants us to deny what we experience, while the God who hates lies wants us to give it credence. The God who demands that I be truthful, Hartman would say, is the God who brings the truth of gender inequality onto my tongue and out into open, listening ears. Rabbi David Hartman was, for me, a mighty partner in this particular tikkun olam, which the God who hates lies is still waiting to see completed.
Moscowitz for the Boston Temple. David Hartman, as we know, was renowned for his deep learning, his divergent thinking, his animation of the intellectual life of the Jews. His was the Torah of Rambam, of the philosophers of Soloveitchik. David Hartman, as we know, was renowned for his deep learning, his divergent thinking, his animation of the intellectual life of the Jews. His was the Torah of Rambam, of the philosophers of Soloveitchik. Hartman's was also the Torah of Hesed. Tellingly, the Rambam and the Rav together held that Hesed embodies kindness. Soloveitchik, finding the thinking of Maimonides, taught Hesed as empathy for the other, identification with the other. In the colloquial, standing in someone else's shoes. When you know and where you know of another's sense of marginality, maybe their fear, and maybe their despair. But that's not the entire picture of Hartman's teachers. They tell us that Hesed goes further than the knowledge of the compassionate other. As well, Hesed requires sharing with the other something of what you possess. What would one possess and share that is essential to Hesed? I'll return to that, but first, a story about David Hartman, a true story. Not many years ago now, walking in Jerusalem, Rabbi Hartman, accompanied by his daughter Tova, crossed paths with a young man known to him. In fact, a student at the Hartman High School. And you would know that the Hartman High School, as with any other such yeshiva, there is an assumption that no student, no young man such as this one, would appear in the public realm without his head covered. Well, not that day, and not that student. And it just so happened that here comes the Rabbi, the Rosh Yeshiva, David Hartman, this large and hardly shy man who wasn't necessarily accustomed to holding his tongue. Well, the Hartman High student sees Rabbi Hartman approaching, but there's nowhere to hide. Bareheaded, nervous, the young man stands there, naked or powerless, waiting for his deserved rebuke. Talk about not wanting to stand in someone else's shoes. What does his rabbi do? With a warm and knowing smile, David Hartman saunters up to his student, hugs him, and then kisses him on the Keppe. Right exactly where the young man belonged. No rebuke, no comment, no words, just a smile, a kiss, the Torah of Hesed. As suggested, the Rav, basing himself on Rambam, understands that Hesed extends beyond synthetic knowledge of the other. Hesed mandates the sharing of one's capabilities with another. Sharing, not in the sense of giving exactly, but rather showing, modeling, teaching, which is precisely what Rabbi Hartman was doing, is it not? Seeing his student there lead Keppe, Hartman shows comfort over confrontation to teach how one wields power in regard to another. Power, wielded with respect, dignifies as it liberates. We can easily imagine, therefore, the relief, joy, the dignity of Rabbi Hartman's student as his Rabbi kissed him on the Keppe before walking away. And we can imagine that this young man now lived something about power he had not previously known. Something powerful and liberating. You can employ power to enhance dignity and to expand life. And in fact, you must do that. And when you do, as Hartman did here, then Hesed is generative, enlarging, and even electrifying. Olam Hesed Yibaneh, taught the Rambam. The world emerges and enlarges itself out of God's generosity. And likewise, later on, so it goes out of the generosity of God's creatures, especially that of God's best teachers. David Hartman enlarged, even electrified, the lives of many Jews. His teaching was his Hesed, and his Hesed was his teaching, whether on the street or in the lecture hall, in the synagogue or in the makom. He enlarged our lives, he liberated us. He moved us from ignorance and sometimes powerlessness to strength and to dignity. We are all that Hartman High student, and we have all been covered and kissed by a rabbi's Hesed and by his Torah. And what David Hartman has left us, therefore, is this gift of his lasting legacy, our own power to do exactly the same, to bring dignity and liberation and knowledge to our people, as he did for us.
Yossi Sapirman of the RLI 4, which is the fourth cohort. Yossi Sapirman of the RLI 4, which is the fourth cohort. I don't know where we were. So I graduated this summer, and I've had the immense privilege of being at the Hartman for 3.5 years. I thought I'd share with you a live teaching, something that I have almost verbatim quoted from Rabbi Hartman, and then just a brief tribute. So in summer 2012, by Yossi, and Joseph was told your father was alien. We were warned that the Rabbi Hartman that we had seen the previous summer was no longer, and he was ill. And because he teaches us in a small group, it was very intense. And so there, we came severely reduced in health. David came to our small group of RLI fellows and gave a shiur about death, but his own death. As expected, his theme was Mishnah and Talmud, and in this case it was the sugya of Alelut, the topic of death, dying, and mourning. And here's what he told us. It starts with one principle, which then encounters another principle and leads to a third. And this is how Talmudic sugyot develop. Internal conflicts from which further elaboration evolves into endless possibilities of conflict and resolution. This is something in and of itself. It tells us that it desires to take the law out of its simplicity by creating contextual conflicts. The law could be stated simply, clearly. Instead, it revels in creating conflicts. Sounds like it strives to shatter simplistic mindsets. Out of Sinai emerges conflicts, not simple answers. This itself is a major revelation. So why did the sages prefer this model? This is an interesting question in and of itself. Why is the tension? Why is there this mode of developing the Torah as Baal Ed, an oral tradition? The answer is the oral tradition grows from internal tensions. And why did the rabbis create tensions and machloket, tension and division and disagreements? And here Rabbi Hartman tells us emphatically, they are opposed to one-dimensional thinking. On one level, the text is oriented towards the tzibur. This text we're studying is about the tzibur, it's about the community. And then it shifts to the need of the yachid, of the private individual. And he says, this is the secret of Judaism. At one moment, you're cast into a deep personal moment, and then you are back pushed into the communal, such as during the time of mourning. The we, and then back into the I. This is the major issue of Judaism, he says. Where are you going to go now? Are you going to go for you, or are you going to go to I, or we? Is it the lonely man of faith, he says, like Rabbi Soloveitchik? Or is Judaism a spiritual we or a lonely I? And once again he says Soloveitchik moved towards the I. And then he shouted at us. Does Judaism thrive on the lonely man of faith or on the minyan? And his answer would be both, but not at the same time. And then he explained, and this is a little Torah for the evening, he said to us something that is possibly familiar. Hamosek b'mitzvah, patur min ha-mitzvah. One who is engaged in a mitzvah is free from the obligation of a subsequent mitzvah. And that's the standard interpretation, but Rabbi Hartman reimagined it. And he says, the world of life is a world which deals with mitzvot. The world of death is removed from mitzvot. The priests who deal with God cannot be involved with death in any way. And on days you're engaged with life or mitzvah, you cannot enter the world of death or the place of, as he said, patur, tira, passing away. But then, as we're listening, this was the unusual. Rabbi Hartman just, in his mind, just slipped away and went somewhere else. You're all sitting there as quiet. And he then says, there are times when you just want to be left alone, in your own aviglut, in your own morning, just want to be left alone. Was that kind of moment where we knew that we were watching the man come for that? It's a remarkable teaching. What was most remarkable for all of us, I think, in the class that day was the courage that it took for a man who was so strong and so powerful to speak, not just of his impending death, but to wrap it within the context that he had devoted his whole life to. Torah, Talmud, argument, context. And despite the fact that it was about him, but it was also a lesson for the ages about death and courage. And for the short time I've had the privilege of knowing and learning with Rabbi Berman, my favorite memory was when he forgot my name or didn't know it and called me Laco instead. It was the greatest thing. I want to say thank you in a short form tribute. This is something I wrote on this passing. Rabbi Hartman's message was clear and absolutely emphatic that full knowledge and understanding of Torah was an uphill winding road all the way. There was no unified theory, there was no avoiding the internal rending that the shedding of deeply ingrained tradition causes. He was on the frontier where risk shaped innovation, where the She'erit HaPleita, the tradition's exiles, survivors of doctrinal mutiny, were the standard bearer of fusion. Evident throughout his teaching is that Rabbi Hartman assumed that paradox was the ever-fused companion to orthodox. A carved tablet of new charisma was necessary to endure unending incongruity, and this character was evident in Rabbi Hartman's will to want. It was evident in his self-refractory engagement, his unabashed desperation, his non-conclusive answers, and his ability to comfort beyond the gap of tehu, meaning we don't know. Rabbi Hartman was willing to want the Torah to be a Masoretic whole, and there was often paradoxically a deep acceptance of Sinai, from Sinai. And from that Evan HaToeh, that rock of claims, he proceeded to challenge as widely as possible without the total loss of the yesh me'ayin, the eternal grain of truth. He shared his own discoveries of Jewish life, his awakenings, and his anger of his marketplace encounters. Babies and neonatal units were the symbol of a revived Zionism, and Yeshiva Buffer mourning on Tisha B'Av the saddest evidence of unadapted Halakhah's autistic-like culousness. It was heartbreaking to hear him tell the deeply sentimental minhagim practiced by his mother that were rendered hollow by his own developed reason, his illustration of why bold thinking was 1,000 cuts on the flesh of convention. He told us that pain is inevitable, and yet for Rabbi Hartman, the inexorable pulsing call to truth was too powerful to remain paralyzed by textual boundaries or two-dimensional halachic stasis. Rabbi Hartman was unwilling to bear the yoke of convention, and by torquing history, law, faith, and tradition, he willingly bequeathed his beloved Klal Yisrael the awareness that the once terrifying heat of friction made by stressing forged words to their limits will still greatly warm the heart of change. He's a photo.
Rabbi Shalom Schachter, my contribution to your teachings tonight, like each of my colleagues, is L'Zecher Nishmat, in honor of the memory of Rabbi David Hartman. We all owe him a debt for his efforts to enable all of us to have a voice in the realm of Torah interpretation, and not limit that voice to Gedolim, the prominent rabbis of earlier generations. Rabbi Hartman stood for the principle that we are all part of the divine covenant, and that we all receive the oral Torah of Sinai. My topic tonight is timing is everything. Time does not stand still, time is always changing. The way we mark time also changes. In the microsphere, many younger people today cannot picture the expression a quarter past the hour, as we have all moved so overwhelmingly to digital watches. Soon hardly anyone will wear a watch because of the prevalence of handheld PDAs. In the macrosphere, Catholics switch from BC to AD, and Jews switch from before the Common Era to the Common Era. My comments tonight deal with relative time in the intermediate sphere, based on the special Torah reading of this past Shabbat, HaChodesh HaZelachem Rosh Chodashim, Rishon L'Chodshei HaShana. This month, for you, will be the primary of months, the first for the months of the year. Indeed, the Shloshim tonight is on the eve of this very Rosh Chodesh Nisan. The foremost biblical commentator Rashi in Breshit, in the opening portion of Torah, cites the teaching of Rabbi Yitzchak that in fact the Torah should have started with a portion of the Chodesh. I would like to share with you a teaching of the 20th century Israeli Hasidic Rabbi, the Steiner, also known as the Netivot Shalom. He explains the view of Rabbi Yitzchak as to why the Torah could have started with a portion of Chodesh. The Steiner points out that this section contains the first mitzvah given to the children of Israel, that we should no longer mark time by the Earth's journey around the sun, like the rest of humanity, but rather by the moon's journey around the Earth. The question was posed as to why the mitzvah of Chodesh is given such prominence, and why it is placed immediately before the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, the sacrificing and eating of the Paschal lamb. Steiner explains that Jews, both collectively and as individuals, are like the moon. The moon goes through phases, getting brighter as it approaches the full moon, and then getting darker until it disappears completely just before the new moon. We too have our ups and downs, and sometimes our trials and tribulations are almost unbearable. But even in the deepest depths of our service, our troubles, we have faith in our redemption. As we read from Psalm 92, to speak of your generosity in the morning and of your faith at night. It is no chokhmah, no cleverness to have confidence in the brightness of day. It is in the darkness of night that the covenant between us and God is emphasized. We believe that just like the moon, our situation will resolve itself and we will emerge in brightness. This understanding of the significance of lunar time gives us the faith, no matter how stuck we are in our own Mitzrayim, our own narrow place, that we will be extricated and that we are even capable of extricating ourselves with God's grace. This faith, engendered by the understanding of lunar time, is so fundamental that it is placed immediately before the mitzvah of the Paschal Lamb, which was the act of faith of individual families of Jews that merited them being redeemed from Egypt. The Steiner teaches that just as our own situation is constantly in flux, and just as we are capable of changing how we respond to our situation, so too is there change in the path to serve God. In every year there is renewal and a new route in the service of God. We are different, and our situation is different, and therefore new possibilities are created to serve God. It is this teaching of the Steiner that Rabbi Hartman, in his own way, so effectively pursued. Rabbi Hartman believed the old ways of understanding Torah should not limit new chidushim, new insights. He believed that there is a dynamic relationship between Halakhah, Jewish law, and history. Unlike Rabbi Soloveitchik, his previous mentor, who stated, "Time comes to a stop for me," Rabbi Hartman espoused the view that our current lived reality must be taken into account for determining Halakhah. Rabbi Hartman established a forum, the Shalom Hartman Institute, which is really an ohel moed, a sukkah shalom, a makom, a sacred place where rabbis and others can come together for limited periods of time in an environment of intellectual and religious openness, and try and discern the lessons to be learned from Torah b'yameinu, in our day, in our time. Rabbi Hartman may be said to have been a man ahead of his time in his objectives of what Halakhah Judaism Judaism could become a society of Jewish sovereignty, but in his determination to go beyond the limits of Torah study permitted by his environment at Lakewood and at Yeshiva University, his time was everything. That determination, which I experienced in Montreal in the 1960s while a student at the equally restrictive Lubavitcher Yeshiva, opened up the path of Torah study to me and to all those who are here tonight to honor his memory. Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir, shine a new light on Zion, that is Kechulanu, so that we can all merit distilling the teachings of Torah in relation to what it means to be a Jew and a human being in our ever-changing lives as we experience God's daily renewal of creation. On the Chadesh L'Tuvah, the Hoyom Tami on Sefer.
Rabbi Morrison of Beth basically a synagogue. My introduction to Rabbi David Hartman of blessed memory was with the Toronto Board of Rabbis in the spring of 2002, when bus bombings were taking place all around Israel, and so many Jewish groups were canceling their trips. And under the presidency of my friend and colleague Rabbi Elyse Goldstein, the Toronto Board of Rabbis arranged a 3-day solidarity visit to Israel. For me, the most memorable stop on the trip was a visit to the Shalom Hartman Institute. Just a few days before our visit, Rabbi Hartman had serious heart surgery, and we were sure someone else representing the Institute would meet with us. But no, Rabbi Hartman insisted to meet with us. He sat with our group for over an hour and addressed all of our questions and concerns. That was my first time ever face-to-face with a man. I was overwhelmed and viewed and engaged. I had one experience with the summer program directed for rabbis in July, a 12-day study program, which I attended the first time 2 summers ago. And one evening, failing from health, Rabbi Hartman spoke in front of some 200 rabbis and others, went on for over an hour, and you could hear a pin drop. Over the years, I've been asked, what kind of rabbi are you, Howard Morrison? I usually say I'm a Jewish rabbi. When that doesn't work, I say that I'm a Klal Yisrael rabbi. I'm a rabbi ordained for the totality of the Jewish people. I personally believe we now live in a trans-denominational era, evidenced by the spectrum of rabbis and guests who are in this room right now. The topic of Klal Yisrael, of religious pluralism, and standards for conversion are topics that are near and dear to my heart. And I have been inspired and challenged by the writings of Rabbi Hartman on these subjects. I didn't bring pieces of paper. I brought 2 of Rabbi Hartman's books. They've been referred to tonight. What I want to do for my 4 minutes, I can now really count. I will share some excerpts, first on pluralism and then on conversion. So on the subject of pluralism, I'm quoting Shalom's books, have them, A Heart of Many Rooms, Celebrating the Many Voices Within Judaism. I'm looking at pages 194 to 203, but I'm only excerpting Rabbi Frydman-Kohl. Israel must be a place where diverse Jewish groups with their own perceptions and values can engage in serious discussion with one another. Respect for religious pluralism is a vital necessity if Israel is to serve as the spiritual and physical home of the entire Jewish people. One cannot embrace Zionism and the law of return, yet delegitimize Reform and conservative rabbis throughout the world. One cannot say all are welcome because we share a common destiny, yet deny them religious freedom and dignity because of their non-traditional belief systems. Rabbi Hartman goes on to write, the fight for pluralism in Israel does not require Orthodox, Reform, or conservative Jews to compromise their appreciation of Halakhah and Torah. It does mean that no group may use the instruments of the state to impose its own interpretation of Judaism on the entire society. The Reform movement's covenantal perspective can serve as a prism through which one can properly define the value of solidarity with the community. In other words, you, referring to the Reform movement, must remind the Jewish community that the covenantal moment is constitutive of Jewish identity. By contrast, the conservative movement does understand itself as a halachic movement. Therefore, its task in Israel is not only to rehabilitate covenantal consciousness, but also to show the wide range of interpretive possibilities allowed for by Halakhah. To be true to its claim to be a halachic movement, conservative Judaism must show that its halachic positions to be validated by the interpretive power of Halakhah. In this way, the conservative movement can show the Jewish world that the 4 cubits of Halakhah are wider than we ever imagined, and that the Jewish tradition has always contained the resources to meet new situations and appreciate new values. Conservative Judaism bears the burden of legitimizing its present actions in relation to the authority of the past. The Reform movement, however, is not burdened by a concern for halachic continuity. It is burdened by the claim of God upon human life, by its receptiveness to the covenantal moment, by its rejection of nationhood as the exclusive value defining Jewishness. Orthodoxy both in Israel and abroad would thrive on vibrant, conservative and reform movements. The presence of alternative options would challenge its membership to build conviction out of understanding. Those are the excerpts I'm reading on pluralism, which I find very moving, very inspirational, and don't hear these sentiments too much from somebody with the kind of credentials that Rabbi Hartman has. And now very briefly, from The God Who Hates Lies, some excerpts on conversion. I will refer to 2 scenarios briefly that he speaks about instead of reading them in full. So he speaks about a couple, man and wife, who converted to Judaism, then had a child, and the conversion was done conservative, but the educational director of the Hebrew school in the shul was Orthodox, and referred to the child as a goy, and everything he touched as being treif, and he used this boy to be a Shabbos goy during Shabbat home programs. That's scenario number 1, which disturbed Rabbi Hartman. Scenario number 2, which he describes, is about an Israeli soldier who adopts a child. And the Israeli soldier is not frum in the sense of how we use the word frum, but knew that to adopt a child, he had to lie to the institutional rabbinate to be able to convert that child. And so this person lied and then was able to adopt and have the child converted. Years later, this person wanted to convert another child to be adopted, but wouldn't lie anymore, and wanted to be honest and true. You can imagine all the problems if that ensued. Rabbi Hartman then describes how he would understand standards for conversion. I just want to read this paragraph because I find it very challenging and also very inspirational. This is page 174 in this book. In my view, Israel allows for a formulation that understands the receiving of mitzvot, not as a total commitment to the tradition in its entirety, as mediated by strictest, most authoritarian interpreters, but rather as a process of experiential education. This interpretation is hinted at in the Talmud, which relates a vignette about a non-Jew who approached Hillel the elder with a proposition. He wanted to convert to Judaism on the condition and it would be taught only the written but not the oral Torah. For the Talmud, rabbinic tradition's canon, the rejection of that tradition, or indeed any one of its constituent halakhot, constituted heresy and a sound reason for rejecting conversion. This view is reflected in the preceding story, in which the same prospective convert approaches Shammai the elder with the same condition and is promptly and angrily shooed off. But Hillel takes a different tack, converting the man on the spot. The medieval commentator Rashi explains Hillel's reason for doing so, that in the educational process to which Hillel would guide him, he would become progressively more accustomed. Hillel, according to Rashi, relied upon this educational process as the means through which the place of authority within the tradition would be better understood and ultimately accepted. What is critical to note here is that he does not make the total acceptance of traditional authority a prerequisite for conversion, and an echo of Hillel's process-oriented approach to conversion can perhaps be found in another rabbinic source, which reports of the saying that one mitzvah leads to another. On this topic, when I studied 2 years ago at the Hartman Institute, one of the many, many scholars who was invited to teach was a Sephardic scholar, not a rabbi, but a great Sephardic scholar named Tzvi Zohar, who actually has a tremendous book, a compendium of the history of conversion and Judaism. You would be surprised to see the many different methodologies throughout the ages. Rabbi David Hartman, was a Klal Yisrael rabbi. He was a pluralist. He was inclusive. And if I were to say that we are part of a particular denomination tonight, what brings us all together is that we are Hartman rabbis and Hartman Jews.
I'm Baruch Frydman-Kohl. I'm one of the rabbis here at Beth. I want to thank Tzedec for encouraging me in the organization of this evening, and I want to thank my colleagues for joining us tonight. And I particularly want to thank those colleagues who kept to the time schedule. I was privileged to know Rabbi David Hartman since a sabbatical that I took in 1987, and have maintained contact with him, members of the family, and with my home at the Shalom Hartman Institute over 25 years. I want to talk about reading Talmud for philosophy. That is a well-developed tradition. There's a rabbinic statement, Chochmah B'Goyim, that non-Torah wisdom is to be found in the nations. And so for some medieval thinkers, philosophy was legitimated out of the belief that it was originally the province of King Solomon, the wisest of all men. Philosophy in that tradition migrated into the Hellenistic world and then returned to the Jewish people. But there were others, such as Yehuda Halevi, who took a dissenting position, distinguishing between the biblical God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of the philosophers. And that perspective, that dichotomy, was continued in modern thought by the Christian mathematical thinker Blaise Pascal and the great Jewish theologian, my teacher, Rabbi Avraham Yehoshua Heschel. But many Jewish thinkers did mine the Bible, and particularly the Talmud, for philosophical ideas. Maimonides saw philosophy and philosophical analysis as integral to Jewish study, codifying the requirement of daily Torah study to include 3 subjects: Bible, Mishnah rabbinic traditions, and Talmud, for which Rambam meant the analysis of abstract ideas. In the early modern period, Moses Mendelssohn followed Maimonides when he described rabbinic midrash as allegorical representation of such truths which people of all ages have been accustomed to purposely withhold from the people and to confine them only to those of higher capacities. In the 20th century, Frydman-Kohl read Talmud passages as expressive of neo-Kantian ethics, just as Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik plumbed the Talmud for existential insights into Halakhah behavior. David Hartman's effort to bring together secular Jewish intellectuals, which he began while he was in Montreal and continued in Jerusalem, in order to read Talmud as philosophy, was paralleled in France by the annual presentation of Emmanuel Levinas to the Colloque des Intellectuels Juifs de langue française. Levinas once said, "A page of the Talmud, though it can be read as a document from a certain period, is, above all, the expression of a teaching of Jewish culture and wisdom. Beyond anecdotal value, it contains a truth, and it is this truth which interests us." Rabbi Hartman's use of Talmud had similar significance. In a conversation last week with his daughter Tova, she suggested that her father's philosophy had 3 parts to it. First, the clarification of ideas. And I want to suggest, here I think he was influenced by his reading of British analytical thinkers. He saw Talmudic dialectic, the brisker Soloveitchik analysis, as an effort to clarify ideas, to explore alternative models. For him, a hava mina in Talmudic language was what philosophers would call a gedenken experiment, a thought experiment, to explore alternative paradigms within Judaism, to set them up one against the other in order to gain greater clarity. Secondly, a search for truth. And this is not truth in a metaphysical sense, because David had given up on that, but rather as an intellectual quest, and even more, as a moral demand. The truth, and this is the third point, the truth of the Talmudic teaching is tested by its relationship to real life. And you've heard that in different ways from every single one of my colleagues. A student of John Dewey and of William James, David Hartman believed that truth lies in relationship to human goals and interests. He was, in many ways, an anthropological thinker, putting human beings at the center of his thought. And David actually understood Maimonides in that same way. One, the Maimonidean method was to clarify what the Talmud really meant. Secondly, to seek the intellectual heart of an issue. And third, to bring its core insight into the world. And so it was Maimonides' integration of Talmud and philosophy that would create what Hartman wrote as the conditions for the realization of the intellectual love of God. For Maimonides, understood by Hartman, Judaism was a practical, political means to a philosophical end. And Rabbi Hartman's own quest for Torah and philosophy, kept returning therefore to Halakhah as a model for what I would call enacted philosophy. For him, Halakhah was the social, political, philosophical expression of Judaism, of virtue ethics with practical impact on the individual and the community, sometimes at the same time and sometimes at different times. David is actually part of a group of thinkers, exemplified by Leo Strauss, for whom philosophy and politics were intertwined. And that is why I believe he was so concerned with the penetration of Jewish ideas and ideals into Israeli society. That is why the Hartman-Yale publication of the Jewish political tradition is so significant. He didn't want ideas to simply be left to the intellectual academic forum. He wanted them brought into real life, where they would interact with real people. And that was part of the vision, I believe, to the creation of the high school in Jerusalem. By understanding Talmud as enacted philosophy, Rabbi Hartman, my teacher, sought to bring abstract ideas from the yeshiva and the academic arena into the amphitheater of applied life. This is his legacy. Use rabbinic dialect as a model for respectful disagreement, and read Talmudic argument as a means to bridge the philosophical and the practical. Yossi Baruch, may the memory of Rav David Leib and Shalom bring us all continued blessing. Please stand for the El Malach.
He has left an indelible mark on multiple generations. He was a teacher to all, whether they agreed with him or not. Rabbi Hartman believed that the establishment of the State of Israel meant a fundamental change for Judaism, Torah, and the Jewish people. In his view, Jews are partners with God in a covenant, and we should therefore adapt religious observance to modern values, a sovereign Jewish state, and a multicultural world. He believed that our voices should be part of the dialogue of our ancestors. He encouraged questions, promoted religious freedom and pluralism, and created a new conversation. Rabbis, tonight, you have demonstrated the depth and breadth of Rabbi Hartman's philosophic teachings. Each of you has addressed a different area of his concern and the influence of his thinking. Your comments reflect his commitment to Jewish learning and intellectual honesty, human dignity, and modernity. You have embraced his challenge to wrestle with tradition, challenge our ancestors, and create new interpretations that recognize changing realities. Your combined participation tonight is indicative of his impact. I want to thank all of you for your role in participating and in delivering the message and a little bit of the life of Rabbi David Hartman to this audience. I want to extend a special thank you to Rabbi Frydman-Kohl of the Hesed congregation for his role in initiating, coordinating, and hosting this evening. We are blessed to live in a community that embraces Jewish life so fully. David Hartman's legacy lives in Toronto through the voices and the teachings of the rabbis and their leaders who have been influenced by his philosophy, and through the ongoing work of the Shalom Hartman Institute. The Shalom Hartman Institute, supported by its Canadian friends, has created a place for people to come, to learn, and to move on, serving their own communities and institutions. As you have heard, and as you will continue to hear, David Hartman, his thinking, his teaching, and his institute changes lives. The Institute addresses issues facing Judaism in the context of Jewish sovereignty, demanding intellectual excellence, the highest ethical standards, and spiritual commitment. It makes room for everyone in the conversation of Jewish history and our shared future, with ongoing programs for rabbis, lay leaders, and scholars. The Shalom Hartman Institute has developed curriculum and introduced Judaic studies through its varied program for Israeli secular high schools, its own Jerusalem high schools, as well as programs for Israeli military officers in the ethics of war. Its Talmudic-based research is now integrally combined with learning initiatives being introduced across North America through the iEngage program. A number of synagogues in Toronto have already introduced iEngage in their adult education programs. The Goldstein Institute here is partnering with the Shalom Hartman Institute to provide professional development to our day schools and supplementary schools. And UJA's Federation has sponsored Shalom Hartman Institute programming for young leadership. I encourage all of you to learn more about the Shalom Hartman Institute at shalomhartman.org. I encourage you to participate in Hartman teaching, in Hartman learning, in Hartman events, both here and in Israel, as that will truly be the legacy of David Hartman, to continue learning in his name. Thank you all for commemorating the memory of our beloved David Hartman, Zichrono Livracha.